Good afternoon. I'm Eileen Appelbaum, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Since its founding 26 years ago, CEPR has provided fact-based, data-driven research and analysis to inform people about the issues of vital importance to them. Thank you for joining us as today's panel discusses what the data show about worker power and unions. This is the time of year that BLS typically releases annual data on union membership. But this year, that data release has been delayed. Today's webinar will fill the gap created by that delay so that unions, worker organizing campaigns, and policymakers have timely information they need for making decisions. There is much to be learned from the available data, and we are fortunate to have a distinguished panel that can lay it all out for us. As I think you know, polls show that public interest and enthusiasm for unions is at an all-time high today. But the elite press largely doesn't cover unions and does a poor job reporting on worker organizing. It wasn't always that way. For nearly two decades until his retirement in 2014, Steve Greenhouse covered workers, worker organizing, shifts in union power, workplace issues, the middle class, and many related topics for the New York Times. I met Steve in the late 1990s when I was studying changes in workplace practices in manufacturing, in steel, apparel, and medical electronics, and I have always been an enthusiastic fan of his work. Steve continues to freelance and write about workers and their struggles, and his insightful articles have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, as well as The Washington Post and Los Angeles Times. Steve has written two powerful books, the award-winning volume, The Big Squeeze, that documents how employers have been squeezing workers to increase their profits, and Beaten Down, Worked Up, the past, present, and future of American labor, that looks at the key points in labor history that built the labor unions, and also how the labor unions built the American middle class. And finally, he looked at the future of innovative organizing and worker power in the U.S. The book is lively and informative and a great introduction to U.S. labor history. I highly recommend it. And its take on the future of worker power, written in 2019, is unfolding today before our eyes. Steve is currently a senior fellow at the Century Fund. It's an honor to have him moderate this afternoon's panel, and I will turn things over to him now.
Thank you for that generous, indeed over generous introduction. We have a great panel today about a very important subject. It's no secret that this is a tough, turbulent time for the nation's labor unions. By many measures, the Trump administration is the most anti-union administration, I would say, in at least a century. But at the same time, public approval of unions is at 68%, pretty much at the highest level in 70 years, since the 1950s. We're seeing huge excitement about unions among young people. The Starbucks union won 125 elections last year, so that there are now over 660 unionized Starbucks across the US. 2 weeks ago, workers at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the nation's largest art museum, voted to unionize, with 542 voting in favor and 172 against. And we see grad student workers and adjunct professors at dozens of universities unionize in recent years, defying notions that it's impossible to unionize in the Deep South. 1,500 workers at Blue Bird Bus Company, one of the nation's largest bus manufacturers, voted in favor of unionizing a few years back. The vote was 697 to 435 to join the United Steelworkers. And the UAW won an election at VW in Chattanooga. So there's definitely lots of life in the union movement. But anti-union forces in the US remain very strong, extremely strong. Indeed, I often argue that corporations in the US are more aggressively anti-union than corporations in any other industrial nation. And now we have a hugely anti-union president and administration. When I interviewed AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler recently, she told me that she thought Trump's order to end collective bargaining for nearly 1 million federal employees was a greater anti-union move, a more serious anti-union move than Ronald Reagan's firing of over 11,300 striking air traffic controllers. Trump has shown great hostility towards the National Labor Relations Board, the federal agency that's authorized, that's empowered to protect workers' rights to unionize. Trump is the first president in history to fire an NLRB member without cause. In this case, Gwen Wilcox, a Biden appointee. Trump next named two pro-corporate anti-union people to serve on the NLRB. One of Trump's three top aides running the government, Russell Vought, head of the Office of Management and Budget, is viciously anti-union. And if you read Project 2025, which Vought had a major hand in writing, you'll see many things, large and small, aimed at undermining, weakening, sabotaging unions. Trump seems to share Russell Vought's view that it's good to traumatize federal employees. Even before Trump won the 2024 election, many newly unionized companies, Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, REI, were digging in, dragging their feet, and seemingly doing lots and lots to prevent their workers from ever winning a first union contract and making major gains that would then encourage even more workers to unionize. And now with the anti-union Trump administration, it seems that those companies and others will dig in even more against ever reaching a first contract and frustrating workers. So with what's happening with the Trump administration and with what's happening with corporate America, the outlook for unions, at least near term, isn't great at all. One would expect that union density would have fallen in 2025, but according to our panelists, that wasn't quite the case. We have an excellent panel today. Suresh Naidu is Professor of International and Public Affairs and Jack Wang, an Echo Ren Professor of Economics at Columbia University. He's an expert on labor markets, workers, political economy, and too many other things to name. Hayley Brown is a labor and disability researcher with the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And Aurelia Glass is a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, whose research and policy work focuses on the American worker. Hayley, take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to have you all here today for this conversation. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists and our moderator for sharing their time and expertise, and my colleague Lisa for ensuring the logistics of this event runs smoothly. We've seen a lot of attention on labor organizing and union activity over the past few years, and 2025 was no exception. The movement story is still complex and it is still unfolding. And this panel is a chance to dig into the numbers, talk through what they might be telling us, and reflect on where we go from here. It's really wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic, and I'm looking forward to a thoughtful discussion and to hearing different perspectives from the panel and from the audience. So I said we were going to dig into the numbers, and you may be asking what numbers, and the answer to that is that it's complicated. As Eileen mentioned, normally the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases its annual union membership numbers in January, but that didn't happen this year. So instead of just waiting for them to do it eventually, we calculated many of the statistics that normally appear in that release using the publicly available version of the same underlying survey data. We have since learned that the Bureau of Labor Statistics plans to release the official numbers next month. As a qualifier, the estimates for 2025 are based on 11 months of survey data rather than a full year due to the federal government shutdown in October. But based on historical averages, this should be sufficient for many of the metrics that we're talking about today. So I'm going to fire off a few numbers here. If you want the full tables and more detail, we released a report today that should be linked in the chat that has a lot more information on all of these things. Starting with the top line, the share of workers who were union members in 2025 was 10%, and this is just a hair's breadth higher than in 2024 when it was 9.9%. 2024 was a historic low, and unfortunately, 2025 was not the year that we reversed the long-term historic decline in union membership in the United States. In the private sector, the union membership rate held steady at 5.9%. The union membership rate in manufacturing was 7.7% in 2025, which is down just slightly from 7.8% in 2024. That's still higher than the private sector average, but it is slightly lower than that 10% average overall. The share of public sector workers who were union members also ticked up slightly from 32.2% in 2024 to 32.9% in 2025. This included an increase in union membership among federal workers, which may seem counterintuitive for those who've been keeping track of Trump's layoff announcements and executive orders targeting union contracts. We dove into this in more detail in the report to try to suss out what was happening, and there's definitely more to unpack. Turning to immigration, the share of foreign-born workers who are union members went from 8.1% in 2024 to 7.9% in 2025. Compare this to the union membership rate for US-born workers, which went from 10.3% in 2024 to 10.5% in 2025. That said, the number of foreign-born workers has steadily increased over the last 3 decades or so, and they make up a growing and vital constituency within the labor movement. And this matters deeply in the current moment, especially given the unprecedented attacks and scapegoating of immigrant workers. We also saw a notable shift when it comes to disabled workers. Union membership among workers with disabilities increased from 9.2% in 2024 to 10.7% in 2025. And this rate surpassed the rate of union membership for those without disabilities, which is the same as the overall average, for the first time in about a decade. This is an area that I focus on in particular, and it's an especially important development given the longstanding economic disparities faced by disabled workers. Union representation has consistently been associated with better wages, benefits, and job protections for this group, so even a modest increase in membership could really matter. Finally, Canada is a country a lot like ours, but one of the many reasons that Canada may be loath to become the 51st state of the United States is that their union membership rate is 3 times higher than the United States is. Canada's is 28.4%, and the US's, as I've mentioned before, is only 10%. Canada's union membership rate is also higher than Hawaii's, which is the US state that had the highest union membership share in 2025 at 24.7%. So I'm really looking forward to discussing these finds and more with the panel here today. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Suresh Naidu.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So, I think there's 2 angles to pursue on this. One is just kind of the broader assault on the BLS and government data in a period that kind of has happened with under the Trump administration. Like 40% of the senior leadership is gone, a quarter of its staff is gone. So while I think they're not going to put their thumb on the scale on the CPS, but they've just pulled back on a variety of activities that just kind of make the economy legible to everyday people. I always find it interesting that the original demand for the BLS came from the labor movement. It was like the Knights of Labor asking for a Bureau of Labor Statistics was a big 19th century demand, because it was the idea of like, we need to understand what wages look like across the economy. And so we should see the attack on government statistics as like part of the broader assault of the Trump administration on kind of like how the American people can make sense of the American economy. It's sort of not surprising that union density is generally a slow-moving subject, even when a slow-moving topic, just because of the size of the U.S. economy. It's you just are not going to see very big changes in union density from year to year, and so where the union density in 2025 is probably going to look very close to union density in 2024 and moving around by a few percentage points. But I think it's interesting, and we can talk about this more in the panel, is that we sort of saw under the Biden administration a whole rash of new organizing, including I think like in 1 year it was like 30,000 new workers kind of got covered by NLRB elections, which is just a very large number relative to the historical average. But a lot of those workers have not been able to get contracts, and it still has to fight against the constant churn of the existing unionized employers kind of going out of business. So basically, in order to keep union density constant in systems like Canada, the US, the UK, you need to be organizing every new plant at a certain fraction because every new plant is born non-union. So, I think while Canada does retain, 3 times the union density and even double the union density in the private sector, it's still experiencing a very long decline. And some work that I'm currently doing with co-authors, we kind of attribute a lot of this to NAFTA and economic integration, particularly with right to work states. So just the right to work states kind of bleed employment from union strongholds. And when Canada was protected from that, Canada union density stayed high. But as Canada integrated with the US, that kind of put a giant sucking pressure on even Canadian union density. And so I think we'll talk more about this in the discussion. I think really the future of the US labor movement lies both in changing labor law, but it's also going to result in changes in just what unions are and how they function. And I think we kind of, the labor movement's sort of slowly losing membership. And the slogan I like to use is that you don't fill a tire through the hole. We're going to have to really radically reconfigure both the national labor organizing context, but even how unions do what they do in order to kind of actually put a dent in the sort of long-term reversal. And I'm sort of happy to talk about that. And a lot of my partnerships are with unions kind of try to do this. And so that's something I'm very excited to talk about going forward. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Aurelia to talk about just more about the dismal state of US labor law in a context of very popular unions.
Thank you so much, Suresh. Yeah, and dismal is definitely a good word for it. And I think that really sums up a lot of the tension that we see that Stephen and Eileen alluded to in their introductions between the really high levels of popularity that we see for unions, which is a lot of the work that I've been doing and showing how that varies across different groups in America, and why union density is still low, and why how that's stayed the same even after a year of administration attacks and hostility towards union organizing in the U.S. Because it does need to be said that unions are very popular. They have been for several years now. Unions reaching some of the highest levels of popularity that they've seen in the U.S. since the 1960s. And what's interesting is how a lot of that interest is concentrated among young workers. Young men in particular, young workers in general, have been at the forefront of some of the highest profile organizing campaigns that we've seen over the last several years. Starbucks being, one of the best examples of that. The service sector, very difficult to organize, but young workers have been at the forefront of forming new unions in this very difficult to reach space. And young men in particular, I did a recent analysis that looks at Gen Z men, and not only are they the most pro-union people who are around right now, they're the most pro-union generation in history. They're more pro-union now than older men and older women were at their age. And I don't really think I need to remind this particular audience that this is because unions are effective. They improve job security, they increase wages, they increase people's access to benefits like health insurance, retirement benefits. And I think for right now, when a lot of working families are struggling with economic headwinds, struggling with rising prices, difficult to access health insurance, I think that's a very powerful message, and it really speaks to a lot of people. And it's where we see this tension emerge with why union density remains so low. It's because our labor law is so broken, and because the Trump administration has spent the last year making sure that it stays broken. One of Trump's first actions was to fire one of the members of the National Labor Relations Board. This is the agency that oversees private sector union organizing for most private sector unions in the U.S. And that left the NLRB without a quorum. They couldn't make decisions for almost an entire year, which meant that in cases like unfair labor practice cases, worker allegedly being fired for organizing activity, there was no way for the court to reach to reach a final decision about those kinds of cases because there wasn't enough people to meet. Replacing other key agency personnel with former management side lawyers that have worked for law firms with an experience of taking management side, and also revoking collective bargaining rights for over 1 million federal workers. Unsurprisingly, last year, when we look specifically at data about new unions organized, private sector organized under the National Labor Relations Act, we saw a decrease in that organizing process. That doesn't necessarily mean that fewer workers were joining unions, because there are other ways for workers to join unions. That doesn't include public sector, for instance, which I think is one of the puzzles that we're sort of alluding to earlier with the unionization data. But it does mean that fewer workers were able to unionize using the formal NLRA process. And, I think that this is just, again, one of the many things that points to what Suresh was pointing to as well, the need for labor law reform. Right now, what we're seeing is a lot of states that are trying to innovate new models for being able to reach workers who previously couldn't organize. California and Massachusetts recently passed laws that allow rideshare drivers who are not able to organize at all under the National Labor Relations Act, that set up an organizing process for them to enable them to unionize and bargain sectorally, covering their entire states and their entire sector. So we are seeing some promising moves on that front, but I think the bottom line is that workers still want to organize. They still want to come together in unions because they know that unions still work for them, but there's just so much hostility to that it really points to the need for significant labor law reform at the federal level.
I will now ask a few questions to the panelists. Let me begin with a question for Suresh. We've all heard about the Trump administration's offensive against unions. It's making the NLRB more business friendly. It's ending collective bargaining for many federal employees. In light of all that, and I think many others will be confused why we've seen union density rise to 10% in 2025, up a bit from 9.9% the year before. But why hasn't union density gone down? Well, why has it stayed the same or nudged slightly upward, Suresh?
So I think there's two. One is just it's a small number. There's just measurement error, and there's some statistical noise going on. But I think another reason is this composition, which is two things. One is the CPS question on unions is only asked if you're employed. And so the idea that you could be a union member but not have a job isn't sort of picked up in the CPS thing. While I think many unions do consider their unemployed members continue to be members, but I think also the sort of changing composition of jobs might mean that we can imagine that a lot of non-union workers have lost their jobs, and so we kind of could see an uptick for that reason. I also think, it is picking up the tail end of the Biden administration's kind of expansion of organizing, which might have pushed some additional workers into getting membership. And so I think it's a small move, and there's many explanations of that, but I think it's not a huge surprise that you can get a sort of tick up in a given year.
And the union numbers are for the kind of an average for the whole year rather than just looking at November, December. So that
exactly. Yep. It's smoothed out.
Okay, thanks. Question for you, Hayley. In which sectors and which industries have we seen union density grow? And in which sectors have we seen it shrink? And ditto about age groups or other groups.
Yeah, so I know I talked a little bit about this, and I can go into more detail about some groups I didn't touch on. So first of all, age groups. We saw about a 0.5 percentage point uptick among the youngest workers, so those ages 16 to 24. And then the oldest workers, those 65 and older, we saw their union membership share go down by about 0.5 percentage point. That said, that youngest group still has the lowest union membership rate of any age group. And again, I don't want to make too much of year-over-year averages because these can fluctuate quite a bit. But generally speaking, what we've seen for age groups is that the labor movement has been older than the workforce as a whole. And that's a problem if you want the labor movement to have longevity. And I know that's Suresh and Aurelia have touched on some of the reasons why it's such a struggle to bring new folks into the labor movement in the United States. I think that another thing that I mentioned previously is just the increase in union membership among workers with disabilities. That's something that I'm looking forward to diving into in more detail, potentially in a future report. But just to sort of give the gist of what potential things that could be going on there, there's obviously there's always the potential that just more workers with disabilities joined unions, but there are also some potential compositional effects that can explain that. So things like somebody who wasn't disabled before develops a disability, and because they're a union member, they're more likely to keep their job. Uh, Things like folks in more unionized occupations or industries being more maybe they're more exposed to something that makes them more likely to develop the disability. So there's a lot of potential things that could be going on there, and it might not be all of a super rosy picture, but it is still an encouraging thing on its face, just because disabled workers, while they make up a tiny fraction of the labor movement right now, benefit hugely from union membership and or union representation in terms of benefits, wages, and accommodations and protections on the job. The other thing that I just want to touch on again is union membership among foreign-born workers. I think sometimes that gets overlooked because the union membership rate for foreign-born workers is lower than it is for workers born in the United States. But because the number of foreign-born workers has grown over the last several decades, it means that that foreign-born workers make up an increasing share of the labor movement. And there's been a trend that I have noticed, particularly on the right, is to characterize foreign-born workers as a threat to unions when actually they're a vital constituency within the labor movement and an important part of the working class. So I think that it's important to note that and to keep that in mind when we're imagining what a union worker looks like.
Thank you. And just following up about another sector, federal employees, and Aurelia or Hayley, I hope you can answer this. So Trump and his administration has ended collective bargaining for a lot of federal employees. At the same time, the federal employee unions have really beat the bushes to try to urge many federal employees to you should really join now, become members. So what's happening overall with federal employee union membership and density?
Sure. I think Hayley can maybe point to some of the more specifics in the data, but I think it's useful to, lay out in particular what the administration has actually done. They issued executive orders that said, citing national security concerns, even though a lot of these workers don't really have a national security related role, to revoke bargaining rights for over 1 million unionized federal workers, which was almost 85% of the total number of workers federal workers who were in unions. That doesn't necessarily mean those workers stop being union members overnight. Those unions don't go away. It's affected things like dues collection. And in many cases, agencies have tried to take the extra step of revoking signed collective bargaining agreements, which is, it's been playing out in the courts to see how that'll actually resolve. But for a lot of those workers, even though like legally speaking, it has affected their ability, their rights under the national security law, there could still be a lot of interest from those workers in being able to join unions. If you're concerned that the government's going to try to take those rights away from you, that for a lot of people, that might be a compelling reason to sign up where they might not have considered it before.
Yeah, I just want to add something quickly just about the data that we see. So I think Suresh talked a little bit about this before, but sometimes looking at annual averages can paper over a lot of volatility that happens within years. So for 2025, we see at the beginning of 2025, which includes January, which was a Biden month, a higher share of federal workers saying that they're union members and or saying that they are covered by a union contract. And then that dips in the second quarter, goes up slightly in the third quarter, and then goes back down in the fourth quarter. Obviously, these are even smaller samples when we're dealing with quarterly data, so we should be interpreting these with caution. But it is interesting to note that if you just look at like all of the federal employment, most of the decline has been in non-postal service employment. So that's going to affect the union numbers that we see. It's something where we really need to wait for more months of data to see how this shows up. But just seeing the annual averages, I think maybe papering over some pretty big shocks that are happening to this group in particular, especially given that a lot of federal workers were laid off permanently on October, which is a month where we're missing data. And I think that keeping an eye on this is going to be important precisely because the most recent monthly numbers are worrying. We need to wait to see how it all plays out.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to a question for Suresh. And Suresh, you touched upon this in your remarks, but some friends of mine have been asking whether, with Trump having fired the head of the BLS, whether we can still trust BLS reports and BLS statistics or has the Trump administration been skewing things, been skewing the truth as it has been with what's going on in Minneapolis? Wanted your sense of things, Suresh.
So I think they proposed this, I think not super credible person to be in charge, and that didn't happen. And I think there was like a there's a layer of professional staff still at the BLS that are kind of doing the things that they do, and they have very high professional standards. And I think we haven't yet seen, I think, a thing where like the unemployment starts really rising really quickly, where the political pressures will then really rise. And so who knows what will happen then. But I think like for at least the Bureau for like the labor statistics, I don't think we've gotten evidence of any thumb on the scale yet. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And particularly when it starts to politically matter, you can imagine that they will kind of make sure that we don't find out about it.
Thank you. A question for Hayley. So the Starbucks union won elections at 125 Starbucks last year. Are we seeing the Starbucks union victories, the Amazon victory, the Trader Joe's victory, the other victories show up in the union membership statistics? Ditto about, all the victories at the universities among grad student workers and adjunct professors. Are those showing up?
Yeah, the short answer is probably not. I'm going to try not to get too in the weeds on this, but basically the way that they ask these questions is, are you a member of a union or professional organization? And then are you covered by a union contract? And when you look at the crosstabs for that, everybody who says yes to being a union member says yes to having a union contract. And this makes sense. This is how unions themselves typically define union membership. You're not considered like a full member in good standing until you're paying dues, and you're usually not paying dues until after you've secured a contract. This matters with respect to the Starbucks workers, Amazon workers, et cetera, because a lot of those folks, while they won their union election, they haven't secured a union contract. So they're not paying dues. They're not going to say yes to that. Do you have a union contract question? And there's a very good likelihood that they are not showing up in these stats. Having said that, people are fallible. Some people might answer that question yes, even though they don't have a union contract. So, like, there is the chance that some of them are in there. But the way that the questions are worded, I would expect most of them not to be because they don't have those contracts yet.
Thank you. Related to that, follow-up question, and I'll steer this to Aurelia and Hayley. Feel free to jump in. Several years ago, we saw landmark unionization victories at Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, REI, Apple, elsewhere. Nonetheless, not Starbucks, not Amazon, not Trader Joe's, not REI have reached a first contract with any of their employees. Apple has. What does that foot dragging or resistance by Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, REI, and others mean for the future of union membership, future of union density, future of the union movement?
Yeah, I mean, what it means is something I touched on a little bit earlier. Labor law is broken. To sort of go into that into a little bit more detail, the law as it is doesn't really impose meaningful penalties upon corporations that break the law during union organizing campaigns. And what's more than that is that, the process of fact finding in deciding these cases, that can take years. An organizer who's fired, is fired by a corporation for organizing activity. It could take years to actually reach a decision in a case like that, by which time, presumably that workers tried to find another job, needed another way to support themselves, and the most remediation that can happen is there's no fine that happens with that. There's no bigger penalty other than offering that worker their job back, and back pay plus some other remunerations on top of that. Like it's just not an effective way for labor law to be set up, where it really stacks the deck in favor of corporations trying to bust unions instead of workers trying to organize unions. And what's important to emphasize, of course, is that this is nothing new. Like this has been the nature of the landscape of American labor law for years and years and years at this point, which is why we've seen this just slow, gradual decline in union density. And it really points to the need for major reform that changes this so that it actually levels the playing field between workers and businesses.
Thank you. Thank you. Hayley, one of the many reasons President Trump has given for his never-ending, nonstop trade war and tariff war is to boost manufacturing in the U.S. Yet we've seen a decline of manufacturing in the US over the past year since Trump took office. Is it possible to assess what Trump's trade tariff wars have meant for union membership and union density in manufacturing and elsewhere?
Sort of. So there's solid evidence that the 2018 to 2019 tariffs were associated with relative reductions in manufacturing employment, especially in more exposed industries, mostly because the higher input costs and retaliation outweighed any protective effect from the tariffs. Uh, this time around, it's harder to assess just because we don't have consistent tariff policies. One tariff is announced one day and then it's rolled back and substituted with something else. They're also a lot less targeted. So my expectation would be that the effects would be both more volatile and probably less protective for manufacturing workers in particular. But it really remains to be seen, and it's difficult to track just because of the chaotic nature of the way that these tariffs are being implemented and rolled out and then rolled back. The one thing I will also mention is that again, manufacturing union membership rates were down by a tenth of a percentage point this year, 2/10 of a percentage point in coverage, and they lost thousands of union workers. In particular, non-durable good manufacturing lost even more than durable good manufacturing. So non-durable goods are things like toilet paper, stuff that you're gonna consume, rather than durable goods like cars. This means that all of those like non-academic UAW workers are not necessarily, at least the data doesn't suggest that they're doing immensely better this year now that there have been tariffs. But again, it remains to be seen, and it's going to be kind of hard to draw a clear causal link just because the rollout has been so chaotic.
So a major sector, of the union movement are state and local employees. They're a big chunk of the nation's unionized workforce. Um, we haven't really discussed them. I'm wondering, are you seeing any trends in union membership there? And I ask that especially with, Trump administration saying it's going to cut off, freeze, gazillions of dollars of funding to 13 blue states, which will probably be the states with the highest unionization for state and local employees. So I'm wondering, what are we seeing? What unionization trends are we seeing with state and local employees? And is the Trump administration, putting a dent in that? Haley or Aurelia?
Yeah. I can just give the stats and then maybe I can turn it over to Aurelia for a bit more context. So at least year over year this year, we saw an increase in union membership rates at the state level, and a reduction at the local level. At this point, it's kind of hard to tell to what extent that is linked to Trump's threats to cut things off, both because those threats are being litigated and keep going back and forth, and because they happened later in the year, so we don't have a ton of data to try to assess it. Once we have more months of data, it might be possible to try to look and see if we're seeing this affect state and local government in blue states that are being targeted more so than in red states. Again, that's going to be difficult though, just because those blue states tend to have higher union membership rates anyway. So the percentage difference that you would see if it gets affected versus what you would see in a red state is going to change just because the baseline is different and the environment for organizing is different too.
Yeah, and touching on the environment for organizing, the other important thing to keep in mind when it comes to state and local government workers is that it's up to the states to decide, what their local law is. That isn't a federal law like the NLRA that sets things for most private sector workers. Instead, it's decided on a state-by-state basis. I mean, in some states, there are no collective bargaining rights for public sector employees. So I think in some ways it can be more isolated from the moves the administration is making. But at the same time, there's a lot more leeway that states have to push things in positive and in negative directions.
Thank you. So my last question before we take questions from the audience, and we invite the audience to pose questions in the chat. Suresh, again, you discussed this a bit during your opening remarks. Can you talk about comparative union density trends, perhaps comparing what is happening in the US with what's happening in Canada and with European countries? And if you want to discuss New Zealand or Australia, or Japan or South Korea or Chile or Argentina, wherever you are welcome.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, US union density is just an outlier in how low it is among all advanced countries, even among when you include Latin American countries. And partly it's because of this system, this Wagner Act system that was like very, I think good for its day, but really sets you up in like organizing each establishment at a time. And when you look at like these two measures of like coverage and membership that Aurelia talked about, or Hayley talked about, which is that if you look in continental Europe, think France, you have very high coverage but very low membership. So French union membership is actually like lower than the US, but they cover everyone, and so they negotiate these agreements that just cover the whole sector, and so you have very, very high coverage with the union contract with fairly low membership, because membership seems to be like the activists that are kind of like get really involved in the union. The countries that have managed to maintain both high membership and coverage are the sort of Scandinavian countries. And the way they do that is by offering these kind of what economists would call selective benefits. So basically, you get access to like extra unemployment insurance. Basically, being a union member gets you something. You get better UI, you get better training programs, you get kind of a whole package of things by being a member on top of the collective bargaining agreement. And in fact, that's like been shown to kind of really respond to whether or not it's tax deductible. So like Swedish labor union membership fell after they stopped making union membership tax deductible. The same, the Trump administration also made union dues not tax deductible in 2017. And so I think there's like, the tools for keeping membership up sort of really in a sustained way really requires kind of like institutionalizing some way to get around the free riding problem that happens when you kind of have like a right to work environment where like if you're covered, there's no real incentive for you to be a member. And so I think that's kind of where the US sits. It has both like very weak coverage and weak incentives to be a member.
So first question from the audience. Can someone talk about the Faster Labor Contract Act? As a union member, somebody in the audience writes, I am concerned about the lack of member ratification. Are any of the panelists familiar with the Faster Labor Contract Act? Or
I could speak a little bit towards, the nature of federal labor law reform, because I think one thing that needs to be said is, and this is something we've touched on a few times, is that the timeline for being able to reach actual like inked signed contracts is much too long, and it points to a failure in our collective bargaining law right now. It's too difficult to be able to reach those points. How long have the first Starbucks locations been unionized, and you're still struggling to be able to reach those contracts. That being said, I think that we have in front of Congress, we've had the sort of gold standard for federal labor law reform, the PRO Act, for years now. It's passed the House. We have a pretty comprehensive set of reforms that are available that can try to alleviate a lot of those problems. So it is definitely a problem that needs to be addressed. But there are like a lot more comprehensive and also, as Suresh was pointing to, even more comprehensive options for trying to implement sectoral bargaining standards and things in the United States that I think can provide much broader and much more significant improvements in American labor law.
Thank you. A question from the audience for Suresh. What does the future look like for what unions can be and where the collective fight for workers goes when the NLRB is being destabilized, especially with the rising popularity of unions, especially among Gen Z, as Aurelia mentioned? What can unions do, and what can workers do outside of unions? And Suresh, I will add, you said you had ideas for how unions should change, how they should do things differently. Maybe you could discuss that as part of your answer. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about this. So one is like, we paint the bleak picture of union membership. But for example, when you look at union financials, there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of money on union balance sheets. When you look at LM2 filings, they're parked in, member service or strike funds or even other like real estate held by unions. And unions have never been held to task by either their membership or external people to just spend the money on organizing. Like we've never really seen, it was sort of promised in the late 90s that we were going to get this like big increase in organizing expenditure. But like, the idea that you collectively could drop $1 billion on a salting program that would just really put a lot of energy into like trying to take advantage of this popularity of the labor movement, we just haven't been tried. And it makes sense because unions are democratic organizations, so they're very accountable to their internal membership. But sometimes that means that internal membership doesn't see the merits of expending the money on getting new members. And so that's kind of a tension any democratic organization kind of has to navigate. But it's one reason that we don't kind of get or it's no guarantee it'll work because, there's lots of obstacles and you lose all the time in organizing. But it's also there's a lot of money there that could be spent if unions were kind of feeling internal pressure to spend it. And so I think that's part of it. The other part of it is that unions vary enormously, even in their own success rates. And so there's a lot, if you imagine taking out the bottom 25% of unions in terms of new organizing successes and replacing them with the top 25%, you wouldn't reverse union density decline, but you would chip away at it in a non-trivial way. And so unions can do better or worse in terms of their organizing, getting dues revenue, and winning things. And I think we can look at kind of adopting best practices from the unions that are very successful at this in terms of moving the needle kind of further along.
Thanks very much, Suresh. A question from Professor John Logan of San Francisco State. This honestly seems like grasping at straws to put a positive spin on data that seems unreliable. Is the panel really saying that if one excludes the hundreds of thousands of federal workers who were union members before 2025, has public sector density actually risen?
I can try and take this. So first of all, it's a fair concern. I wouldn't necessarily say that the data are unreliable so much as we need more of it. So we're getting kind of hints and inklings right now, but just hesitant to sort of draw hard and fast conclusions from it just because we need a bigger sample size and because so many of the developments that we expect to affect the public sector numbers took place later in the year, and they're not necessarily going to show up starkly in an annual average that includes things from before when those shocks happened. I don't know if it's really hard to put a positive or a negative spin on it because there are still some outstanding uncertainties with this. I don't think that you can conclusively say that because union membership shares in the public sector went up that this represents some massive organizing victory. But I also don't think that this means that we should dismiss the data that we have because it's potentially giving us insights into an interesting and still unfolding story.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. I'd like to, and any of you feel free to answer. How important is strengthening union democracy to increasing union membership?
I have thoughts on this one too, actually. The short answer is it's very important. One of the things that makes the labor movement so effective is that it is by workers and for workers, and that folks in the working class feel like they really have a voice in their future and they have agency that our current system, which has a huge power disparity between employers and workers, doesn't give them without that, unless there's that collective voice. It also has resulted in some tangible organizing victories. So I'm gonna throw in the UAW stuff as a really clear example of this. The innovations that came from those stand-up strikes directly followed from a switch to a more democratic representation model within the union itself. And what we consistently see is that increased union democracy tends to result in more ambitious, more militant labor actions and results in greater satisfaction among the union members themselves, even if it means that sometimes there's more clashes because people feel more comfortable disagreeing with one another. It eventually yields material results, and it gives people the feeling that they have a stake in their union rather than just having it be the third party that union busters try to pretend that it is.
Yeah, I do want to just add in real quick. It can go the other way too, of unions as a means to strengthen democracy. As Hayley pointed out, they're democratically organized, and they're able to organize their members as an institution, to educate their members about electoral issues, things like that. So we could also see there's a link in the other direction as well.
Thank you. Question: based on the CEPR report, it looks like the Black unionization rate declined while it increased for other racial groups. Is this correct? And if so, are there any reasons for why this is the case?
Yes, this is correct based on the data we have. And this is something that I am hoping to try to. I don't think that we can state conclusively from what we've explored so far what exactly drove that, although I have some theories. But I think this is something that we'll want to dig into in the future. I will say that Black workers still have the highest union membership rates among all of the racial and ethnic groups that we looked at in the report. So while their union membership share fell more than it did for other groups, it's still higher than those other groups.
And if I may just add, stepping out of the moderator role, there are many articles, studies last year saying that, a disproportionate number of government workers, federal workers are African American. So when a lot of them are being laid off, that will disproportionately hurt, African American union membership, right? And maybe that hasn't shown up, but I imagine it will. So
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, we've definitely seen a lot of things targeting Black workers in particular this year. The full out attack on DEI policies, which are basically just being they're weaponized racist policies at this point. We would expect that to affect Black workers more so than white workers, for example. But it's just hard given the data that we have here to conclusively state that.
thank you. Another question, probably for Suresh, but anyone feel free to answer. Could the panelists speak to the potential of sectoral bargaining to increase union density in the US?
So I'll say it's interesting. I think we can increase coverage a lot with sectoral coverage, and that's great because we can raise wages for workers and lots of sectors with a big public footprint. I think the evidence so far on the effects on being able to drive membership is a little bit mixed because, it's a right to work environment in some ways that like you get coverage, but what you don't get you don't get anything by being a member. So some work we've sort of been working in Minnesota, it's the home care workers, they're covered. The union can win them massive increases, but they translate into very small increases in membership. Because they can and people do reciprocate, but the magnitudes are extremely small. And so you need to be winning massive contracts for an enormous number of workers to get enough new members to kind of finance a union. And so I think like it's one peg of a strategy, but it can't be like the only peg for raising density.
Thank you. For anyone, has there been any significant increase in recent years in the amount of funds and the amount of money that unions are devoting to organizing? And, I guess that question could be asked, labor movement wide, and are there any specific unions that have really upped their spending on organizing?
I can answer this, although I don't have the most recent 2025 data, but at least 2023, 2024, it depended on the union. For a lot of unions, the answer is no. They have not spent a significant share of their resources on new organizing in particular. UAW and Workers United, which is an affiliate of Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, have done something a little bit different, and they've actually dramatically increased spending to support both campaigns. I am of the mind that that is an important thing. It's been high profile. It encourages people to see unions as a vehicle for material gains when they see those wins and then they see strong contracts happening. But at least for the data that I have for 2024, we haven't seen a particularly large increase in organizing spending. I would understand if unions right now are devoting an increasing amount of money towards litigation because they're having to fight for things that they'd already gained in court a lot more than they had under the Biden administration. But not really seeing evidence that there's been a massive reallocation of resources towards new organizing.
Thank you. So I have one more question. This is from me and not from the audience. And I don't want this to be the only panel held in the United States over the past 24 months that did not mention the phrase AI. So I don't want to be delinquent about that. So, we're seeing, lots of talk, lots of investment in AI. how might that affect union membership, if at all, and union density too?
So I can talk a little bit about this. I do think the sectors that were early affected by this, which is like clearly software engineering, and we saw this with like the writers guilds. Just part of it is trying to negotiate contracts that either protect your job or protect your production process and give you some autonomy from CEOs that are like, use AI. We don't know for what, but just use it. And then I think the other part of it is that, I think a long-standing tradition in the longshore workers to responding to modernization things was to just ask for insanely generous severance payments in your contracts. It's like, okay, if there's this much productivity gains on the table, buy us out. And that's like something that you can put in the that you can put in a collective bargaining agreement. So I think, if they're, and who knows, right? I don't know if we're going to really replace everything with AI. I'm a little bit skeptical of that. But I think to the extent that it's part of the ongoing process of trying to automate different forms of labor. The AFL-CIO in the 1960s kind of publishes a report on like how to think about the response of increasing automation in the U.S. economy. And so it's not, I think, a particularly new problem. It might be happening faster than we can react. What I would like to also see, though, is a little bit more inside unions on how to take that internally. This is a little bit of what unions can do. If you just look internally at a union's bureaucratic processes, they are in the 1970s. And like there's a very little in the way of energy to try to innovate and make a union an extremely efficient bureaucratic machine. And I can see that there's lots of, obviously AI is a problematic technology, but to the extent that you have to manage grievances, handle a contract, deal with lawyers, there's ought to be some ways in which all this technological stuff can be working for you.
Thank you. Someone has a technical question. What are some sources for union density data?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So the source for the data in the report is the current population survey, specifically what they call the outgoing rotation group, which I don't want to get too in the weeds on what the outgoing rotation group is and how that works. But basically, the way that we were able to compile these numbers is we got the underlying survey data for that survey, which includes two questions about unions. One of them is, are you a member of a union or similar professional organization? And then the other one is, are you covered by a union contract at your job? We were able to get the underlying survey for that, use statistical software to analyze the survey, the publicly available version of the survey results, to generate some of these numbers because we can cross-reference it with other questions that they ask in the data set. The numbers that the Bureau of Labor Statistics typically releases in January and is going to be releasing in February this year are based on the same source, on that same survey data. They do use slightly different internal weights, so there might be some variation between what we're able to compute and what they compute. But it's the same general data source. It is compiled by the federal government. It is free to access. It's important that it remain free to access. I think I saw someone else ask about whether or not suddenly we're going to have to do some sort of privatized subscription-based service to continue getting this information in the future, and I really, really hope not. But for right now, we have this wonderful free resource that our taxpayer dollars pay for through the federal government, where they compile this information on a monthly basis, and the folks at the Bureau of Labor Statistics are really thorough, and they do a great job.
Thank you. So thanks for answering all these questions. Very helpful, very informative. So now time for closing remarks. I'm told, Suresh, you're a leadoff batter on this.
Yeah. So I don't really have any closing remarks. I think for all of the dismal situation, there is still this large amount of energy on the ground, and I think we will be surprised by what people do. I hear from all my sources in Minneapolis, the labor movement's at the lead in what's going on down there, and so if you've got to kind of go through this nadir of things in order to bounce back, then we're certainly in the nadir of things. yeah, I just wouldn't read too much into the density numbers per se, because this is like a social movement that's got to get rebuilt, and it might be a long time before we see it in the data.
Thank you very much. Aurelia?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Suresh was saying. It's the data points to unions are popular right now. People want unions. They're an effective way for people to try to deal with rising cost of living and things like that. And even in a hostile regulatory environment, workers are still trying to organize. The difficulty in converting that popularity into new contracts just points to, for one thing, the hostility in the current environment, but also just the very long-standing difficulty under our regulatory landscape for actually making it possible for workers to be able to reach those first contracts. So I think that, and again, there are some bright spots of state and local lawmakers who are, I had touched earlier on rideshare drivers who are looking for new ways to try to, innovate new models for organizing workers who previously couldn't be organized.
Yeah, what I want to echo what Suresh and Aurelia have pointed out. I think that these numbers are a great way to sort of ground the discussion in a starting point, but they definitely don't tell the whole story, and the story is still being told. I also would just note that historically, labor law has responded to union militancy and not necessarily the other way around. So a lot of the wins that we saw early in the labor movement in the United States were not necessarily because the law just sort of permitted workers to do that, but because workers really took risks and were willing to do it anyway. And we're starting to see some of that in Minneapolis now, just from the stories that I'm hearing on the ground. So I think that that's really promising, and it speaks to the extent that the working class, in an organized labor movement style way, is going to be essential to preserving democratic norms in this country and making the new version that arises fairer towards workers. It's something that workers are. I'm seeing workers fight for, and they're going to have to fight for. It's not necessarily something that's going to be given to them, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. So to conclude, I've been writing about labor since 1976 when I first became a reporter at the Bergen Record in northern New Jersey, and that was a heavily industrialized area. I was the economics writer. And, one of the big issues, conundrums, puzzles that, Aurelia, Suresh, Hayley have discussed is that, unions have very strong public support, 68%. Tom Kochen and others at MIT have done studies showing that basically 1 in 2 US workers say they would vote to join a union today if they could. Yet, just, 9.9%, 10% of workers in the private sector. 1 in 2 say they'd join a union today if they could, yet only 1 in 10 in the private sector in unions. And there's something, moderator's not supposed to be talking like this, but there's something off balance, off kilter when so many people want to join a union, and we're supposedly a democracy where people can, have their wishes, fulfilled at the ballot box. And, it's so hard to get to win a union at your place of work. And then even when you do, it can take 3, 4, 5 years and perhaps never to get a contract. So, these are issues that, the 3 of you have shed a lot of light on, and hopefully someday we will brilliantly figure out some answers to these questions. Thanks very much. I thank everyone in the audience for tuning in. And thank you, Lisa, for doing such a great job setting this up. Thank you, Eileen. And thanks again to Hayley, Aurelia, and Suresh.